and welcome back to episode 6 of Lighthouse Health and Safety Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Chandran. In episode 5, I introduced you to my own mental health program called The Right Way to Wellbeing. Within it, I described the importance of managing ego and developing advanced resilience. The purpose of today's topic is to explore ego and how it manifests in the workplace. And when we talk about mental health and look at most modern day programs, they will emphasize the importance of identifying what your psychosocial stresses are in your work environment and reducing your risk. But here's the catch. If you look at the traditional list of psychosocial stresses, and you can find this on Safe Work Australia's website, or you can find it in ISO 45003, you'll notice that most of them are not related to the physical work environment, but rather the people work environment. And this is where ego comes in. And if your mental health program does not strategically address ego as part of it, then I do not believe that it will be sustainable. So where do we begin with ego? How about we start with a quote from 3,000 years ago. The ego is the greatest enemy of the self. It is born of ignorance and it causes endless suffering. The wise person should conquer the ego by the power of knowledge. And that quote is from the Bhagavad Gita, which is probably the best known of all Indian spiritual scriptures. In essence, it's a discourse between a mortal man and his spiritual guide. And it talks to the metaphorical battle each human being must face within themselves and their struggle for self-mastery. Ultimately, if we want to achieve lives that are filled with meaning and significance, a life of purpose, then it is a battle that must be fought. This is the battle within oneself, our battle with ego. So what is ego? Ego is a term coined by Sigmund Freud in 1923 to describe one of three parts that comprise the human psyche. And firstly, we have the id, which governs our basic drives and passions, such as our need for sustenance, to procreate, for safety and security as examples. Then we have the ego, which manages the desires of the id, but protects itself from the superego, which is the third part. The superego. It is our conscience, or as I like to think of it, your better self, your advanced self. And although the scope of this presentation is really on the management of the ego, I don't want you to go away thinking that ego is a bad thing, because it can be a very, very important thing that keeps you alive. Which brings us to the importance of ego. Our ego promotes our sense of self and self-importance. The role of the ego is to protect the self first and foremost. It's an important survival mechanism because it helps a person attribute value to their life. So now, for the astute listener, you will realize the relationship of ego and mental health. It helps a person attribute value to their life. And in a life or death situation, the ego is going to want to put you and your survival first. Now, the way I like to think of it is, if you've ever been on an aircraft and you've sat through the safety briefing on an aircraft, the steward will explain to you that if there's a loss of cabin pressure, the oxygen masks will descend from the ceiling. And when this happens, they're very clear about what to do. They say, before you attend to anyone else, including children, you are to put your mask on first. You are to make sure that you are okay before you make sure that other people are okay. Now, this plays directly to the ego, because the ego wants to look after you first and foremost. You are the most important thing to your ego. Now, meanwhile, your superego is saying, no, no, attend to the children and the vulnerable people first. Put other people first ahead of yourself. But there's a lot of sense in attending to yourself first, because once you're in a good place, once you are safe, then you can look after other people. So there's a lot of sense to the safety briefing, but it is a good example of how it plays to the ego, which is to look after number one, and that's you. So back to mental health and the ego. Let's explore the relevance of the ego to mental health. The ego manages the desires of the id, but it protects itself from the superego. So if ego manages desire, then what is desire? Desire is a strong feeling of wanting. For example, a desire for wealth, a desire for control, a desire to feel important, a desire for power and authority, a desire for control. All of these are illusions, or Maya. But in reality, the real world, they occupy a great deal of our thought and time, which makes them seem to have great value to us, and by association makes us feel like we have great value ourselves. However, our desire causes us to form attachments to things. Attachments to money, attachments to reputation. When we lose these attachments, we experience distress. And when we experience distress, guess what? We can then suffer loss. And the magnitude of loss that we suffer is directly related to the strength of our attachment to the thing that is lost. So, it is the ego that is responsible for the strength of our attachments and therefore the magnitude of our losses. Can you see where I'm going with this? In a sense, our desires are similar to hazards. Our exposure to them results in attachment to things, and when we lose those things, we suffer harm. This is what a hazard is. It is something that causes harm. The strength of our attachments we form from our desires represents our risk. And the stronger the attachment, the greater the distress when it is taken away. So, by now you can see that the study of ego will improve your understanding of mental health risk. This is why the time spent on learning about ego is so important if we wish to end our suffering, start healing, and make a sustainable difference to our mental health. So now we can see the relationship between ego and mental health and risk. But let's look at how ego manifests in the workplace. Ego manifests itself openly when we start comparing ourselves to other people or things. We often judge ourselves by other people's standards, and we judge them by ours. This is the ego. It seeks to win, to dominate, not to learn or nurture. In the workplace, ego will often manifest when someone is challenged, and particularly so if they are challenged in an area that they feel quite confident in. And this is why I will often say to my students in the martial arts and to my work colleagues, never fight in someone else's arena. And just to make the point, here's an example. I was sitting in an office environment one day when I overheard a couple of my colleagues having a heated discussion because one of the colleagues' laptops wouldn't work properly following a recent cybersecurity software upgrade. Now, I was aware that it was coming. I followed all the instructions myself, and they were really good. They were good instructions. They were clear. There were pictures. I had no issues. But this other person did have an issue and clearly wanted everyone in the office to know about it. And as I sat there listening to the stubborn bickering, I really felt like getting up and saying, stop talking and start listening. Because that's often the problem. You know, the person that had an issue thought that they knew better than the subject matter expert and simply wanted to argue about it. Because to them, it wasn't their fault. It was somebody else's. But remember what I said. Never fight in someone else's arena. Because if you do, 9 times out of 10, you will lose. And that will make you feel very foolish. You know, these days, especially on social media, it appears that most people want to be seen and heard, but very few are willing to listen. My suggestion: engage your ears before you engage your mouth. Or as Stephen Covey once said, seek first to understand, then be understood. One of the greatest dangers of ego is it can shut down a person's learning very, very quickly. So here are some of my thoughts on learning and ego. Firstly, you don't know what you don't know. And as soon as you think you know better, your learning stops. Everyone has something to teach, and everyone has something to learn. Acknowledge your failures because they are opportunities to learn, and avoid embarrassing other people because that is very difficult to forget. In my training, I see ego manifest every now and then in the students I teach. But until now, I have not mentioned what it is that I actually teach. I teach an art called Kenjutsu, which means the art of the sword. It's an ancient martial art which the samurai employed in battle, and a good portion of the art involves mastering one's ego. And this is largely where my understanding of ego has developed from. In training or in martial arts, you will often know when ego will pop its head out. When a person develops a degree of confidence, either in their training or perhaps in the workplace, through their knowledge and skills and experience, ego may rear its head. And it will tend to do it when a person has a degree of confidence. Because at this point, they are thinking, well, I know stuff. I have skills, and I think I know best, right? You know, the purpose of martial arts is not to learn how to defend oneself. It is not about defeating an opponent. It is first and foremost about defeating the ego within you. This is what we train for, because once we are able to defeat the ego within and we develop self-mastery, we are then in a position to help society. Much like the mask that falls from the cabin ceiling in the aircraft. You make yourself better, and then you can make everyone else better. And this is how I choose to live my life. Now, I've spoken a lot about ego and its relationship to mental health. I've shared some examples of what ego looks like, but until now I have not mentioned how to manage it. Here's the secret. If you want to manage ego, you must learn to serve. You know, what we do and what we say is not as important as how we make other people feel. Good service is about creating good experiences for others. And those good experiences become cherished memories. And I want to share with you a story of when I worked in Qatar at a place called Dukan gas field in the summer of 2003. I was a young man, mid-20s, conducting a health risk assessment. I was a consultant, and I visited Dukan gas field, and I met the site manager. And the site manager was an individual of Indian descent. Okay, my ancestry is Indian as well, and other things. He seemed to take quite an interest in me as I was explaining the work that I was doing. Obviously I had a very different accent from most people over there. He took a great deal of interest in me, and he invited me to stay for lunch at the gas plant. And I said yes. And when lunchtime came, I watched in awe as the boardroom was transformed into a buffet. Right, bain-maries were carried in and put down, and they had papadums, they had rice, they had dal, they had curries. And the site manager, he picked up a plate, he put some rice, he put some dal, he put some curries, he put everything from all the bain-maries, and then he gave it to me. He gave a plate of food to me before he'd served himself or allowed anyone else to serve themselves. And I will never, ever forget this gesture from the most senior person on site giving effectively the most junior person, a visitor, a consultant no less, not even an employee of the company, a plate of food. This experience is one that I cherish. I will never ever forget that. And of course, through that learning, I try to do the same for other people. And this is what leadership looks like. This is what service looks like. This is what managing ego looks like. And I cannot emphasize enough the importance of practicing humility as the fundamental strategy to manage ego. Accept that you don't know everything. Realize that you're always learning. Show gratitude. It is better to be kind than nice. What do I mean by this? If you're nice to people all the time, then people will think that you're nice. But being kind can actually mean correcting people when they're in the wrong. It might not seem like the nice thing to do at the time, but over a course of a person's life, that lesson will be part of their ongoing growth and development, and they will become better for it. And that's what it means by it is better to be kind than nice. Treat your teachers, mentors, and places of learning with utmost reverence. In Japanese martial arts, we refer to the instructor as sensei. That term sensei means one who is born before, or one who has walked the path that you are yet to walk. It is a very reverential term. and all teachers should be treated with reverence. Understand that your ego is the greatest impediment to learning and to bettering yourself. Mastering your ego means you are developing your better self. You will have better relationships at work and at home. And just to finish off today's episode, I'd like to share with you a quote from Marcus Aurelius, former emperor of Rome, who lived between AD 121 to 180. The last thing he writes in his book of meditations is this: when you have trouble getting out of the bed in the morning, remember that your defining characteristic, what defines a human being, is to work with others. Humans were made to help others, and when we do help others, we are doing what we were designed for. And so we've come to the end. And I hope that you found this insightful. I hope that you've learned something, and I most especially hope that you apply it in your workplace, because the more people that understand the importance of ego, the more likely we are to succeed at creating sustainable mental health. And if this episode piqued your interest, I will talk about ego a little bit more in the next episode, which is how to build advanced resilience. But until then, be well, stay safe, and see you later.